Munich, Germany, November 8, 1923. The night air carried the first bite of a Bavarian winter, the kind of cold that settles slowly into stone walls and cobblestones, and the collars of overcoats. Along the Residenzstrasse, the old buildings of the city stood as they had for centuries, their facades pale in the gaslight, their upper windows dark. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell counted the hour and went quiet again.
Inside the Bürgerbräukeller, one of Munich's largest and most famous beer halls, 3,000 people had gathered for an evening political meeting. The hall was warm with the press of bodies, fragrant with malt and tobacco, loud with the particular noise that fills a large German room in winter, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional clink of a heavy stein placed on a wooden table. Men in suits and uniforms sat along long rows. The evening had an air of routine, of the ordinary political life that had, in the years after the Great War, become turbulent and strange.
The speaker at the front of the hall was Gustav von Kahr, the state commissioner of Bavaria, a careful and cautious man whose political power in the region was considerable. He had been speaking for perhaps half an hour when, at around 8:30 in the evening, the doors burst open.
What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would take years to fully unfold. Years of courtrooms and prison cells, of notebooks and self-invention, of a man transforming the rubble of failure into the architecture of something far more dangerous than any street march or coup attempt. It would become one of history's most instructive lessons in how badly a moment of defeat can be misread and how the seeds of catastrophe can lie quietly in what looks, on the surface, like the end of a story. To understand the night of November 8, 1923, it helps to understand the Germany in which it happened. The country was, in almost every measurable sense, exhausted and humiliated. The First World War had ended just 5 years earlier, and the peace imposed at Versailles had stripped Germany of territory, military strength, and national pride. The economy had collapsed with a particular cruelty. By the autumn of 1923, inflation had spiraled so far beyond comprehension that workers were paid twice daily so they could spend their wages before the money lost further value. Wheelbarrows of currency bought a loaf of bread. Savings accumulated over lifetimes dissolved into worthlessness in weeks. The social fabric frayed. Veterans who had returned from the trenches to find nothing waiting for them organized into paramilitary groups. Political extremism, of many varieties from many directions, found fertile ground in the wreckage of ordinary life.
Into this climate came a young man who had fought in the war, painted watercolors for a time, slept in Vienna shelters, and developed a consuming interest in political speaking. His name was Adolf Hitler, and by 1923 he had risen to lead a small but energetic national party in Munich called the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartie, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He was 34 years old, Austrian-born, with no formal education beyond secondary school and no military rank above corporal. What he possessed, in extraordinary measure, was a voice.
He had studied how people listened. He had stood on street corners and in small halls and watched what moved a crowd and what left them unmoved. He had learned to build feeling slowly, to begin quietly, and let frustration gather and rise until the room itself seemed to vibrate. By 1923, those who heard him often described an almost physical effect, something that bypassed normal reasoning and struck at something more primal and less cautious. His party had grown, his rallies had swelled, he had begun to believe the moment was arriving.
He looked to Italy, where Benito Mussolini had marched on Rome the previous year with his fascist followers and seized power through an audacious show of force. Hitler believed that something similar could happen in Germany, that if bold men moved boldly, the nation would follow. He called his plan the Putsch, the push.
The man who gave the word for the doors of the Bürgerbräukeller to open was Adolf Hitler himself. He entered the hall with a contingent of his followers, the Sturmtauben, the stormtroopers, who took positions around the exits and set up a machine gun in the doorway. Hitler climbed onto a chair and fired a pistol shot into the ceiling to silence the crowd. Into the stunned quiet, he announced that the national revolution had begun.
It was theater, carefully staged. He led Carr and two other senior officials, the commander of the Bavarian state police and the commander of the German army in Bavaria, into a back room where he attempted to convince them, under duress, to join his cause and march on Berlin. He told them that the old government was finished, that a new order was being established. He was passionate, urgent, dramatic. For a brief moment, exhausted and frightened, the men seemed to agree. The celebrated General Erich Ludendorff, one of the most famous military figures of the war, arrived at the hall and lent the scene an air of legitimacy. If Ludendorff stood beside this movement, surely it carried weight. Surely history was being made.
But history, as it turns out, is rarely made on schedule. Through the night, things fell apart. The officials Hitler had pressured slipped away once he was distracted. The army and police, whose cooperation he had assumed, did not join. Orders were confused, units arrived in the wrong places, and the momentum that Hitler believed he had created dissolved in the cold early hours of the morning. By dawn on November 9th, the putsch was already failing. Still, Hitler decided to march.
On the morning of November 9th, a column of approximately 2,000 men set out through the streets of Munich toward the city center. Hitler walked near the front, beside Ludendorff. They carried flags and weapons. They believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that the sight of them moving through the streets in daylight would be enough to tip the balance, that police and soldiers would step aside, that the city would recognize the moment it was witnessing.
They were wrong. At the Odeonsplatz, near the Feldherrnhalle, the great loggia honoring Bavaria's military heroes, a line of state police blocked their path. There was a brief, confused moment, and then gunfire. Accounts of who fired first have never been entirely settled. In the exchange, 16 of Hitler's men fell dead, along with 4 police officers. Those beside Hitler dropped to the ground. Hitler himself stumbled or was pulled down and was later found to have dislocated his shoulder. The march was over. The putsch had failed. Hitler fled the scene and was found 2 days later at the home of a supporter in the town of Uffing, hiding in a wardrobe. He was arrested, charged with treason, and taken into custody. His movement seemed finished. His name, to many observers, had become a footnote, one more fringe figure who had reached too far and fallen. What no one fully anticipated was what would happen at the trial. The proceedings began on February 26, 1924, in Munich, in a converted officers' mess hall that served as the courtroom. The charges were serious. Treason in Germany at that time could carry the death penalty, or at minimum, for a foreign national, Hitler was still technically Austrian, deportation and permanent exclusion from German political life. But from the moment Hitler stood to speak, something became clear. He had not come to defend himself. He had come to prosecute the Republic. The judges allowed him remarkable latitude. The presiding judge, George Neidhart, was himself a conservative nationalist who felt considerable sympathy for the defendants. Rather than limiting Hitler's speeches to matters of legal defense, Neidhart permitted him to speak at length, sometimes for hours, about the humiliation of Versailles, the corruption of the Weimar government, the betrayal of the German soldier, and the necessity of what he had tried to do. The courtroom became a stage. Reporters filled the press gallery. Newspapers around Germany published transcripts. Hitler, who had previously been known mainly in Bavaria, became a national and then an international figure.
He made no apologies. Instead, he reframed the entire event. The real traitors, he argued, were the men who had signed the armistice in 1918. The real criminals were those who had accepted Versailles. He and his men had acted out of love for Germany. If that was treason, he would wear the label with pride. The effect on the courtroom, and on many who read the transcripts, was considerable. Men who had come to watch a prosecution found themselves witnessing something closer to a political declaration. When the verdict was announced on April 1, 1924, Hitler received the minimum sentence for treason, 5 years, with the likelihood of early release. Ludendorff was acquitted entirely. The judge told Hitler that he clearly acted from pure patriotic motives. He had turned defeat into platform. He had transformed a failed coup into a national audition.
The fortress at Landsberg am Lech sat on a gentle rise above the river, its towers visible from the valley below. It was not a harsh place. Political prisoners of Hitler's kind were given comfortable quarters, allowed visitors, permitted to receive gifts of food and flowers, and largely free to spend their time as they chose.
Hitler received a stream of admirers. He held court in a room that filled, on some afternoons, with more visitors than a small party conference. He was given a larger cell that could accommodate a table, books, and some degree of comfort. He was, to those who came to see him, not a prisoner, but a hero, temporarily inconvenienced.
And he wrote, he dictated, in fact, to a fellow prisoner named Rudolf Hess, who typed as Hitler paced and spoke. The text that emerged was sprawling, self-absorbed, and in places barely coherent. It was also, in its way, extraordinarily revealing. Hitler put down in plain language the ideas he had been developing for years, his views on race, on German destiny, on the enemy he believed was working against all that was good, on the strategy that would be required to set things right. He called it, at first, 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice. His publisher suggested a shorter title. Mein Kampf, My Struggle, was published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926. Initial sales were modest. Many who read it found it tedious and repetitive. Few who reviewed it grasped with any urgency what it actually described. He was released from Landsberg on December 20th, 1924, having served just over 8 months of his 5-year sentence. There is a particular quality to the years after the putsch, the middle years of the 1920s, before the Great Depression arrived to unsettle everything again, that asks something of us when we look back. Germany was, in those years, recovering. Inflation had stabilized. The economy was improving. Cultural life in the Weimar Republic was vivid and creative, full of music and art and cinema, and the particular energy of a society trying to find itself after catastrophe. The extremists on all sides seemed less threatening. Hitler's movement struggled for funds and membership. Elections returned poor results. A number of people who watched him observed with some relief that the moment had passed. Even Hitler seems to have understood that the direct approach, the march, the gun, the seized moment, had failed. The state had shown it would resist a frontal assault, so he revised his thinking. He would come to power through the system he despised. He would use elections, speeches, newspapers, rallies, all the machinery of democratic participation, until he had accumulated enough support to hollow out democracy from within. He was patient in a way that his earlier recklessness had not suggested he could be. The apparatus was rebuilt quietly. The party was reorganized. The speeches continued. The audiences grew slowly. And then, with the economic crisis that began in 1929, with extraordinary speed. All of it,
The rebuilt organization, the national name recognition, the carefully published ideology, the carefully cultivated image of the wronged patriot traced back to the 9 days of November 1923 and the months in Landsberg that followed. What had looked like the end had been, in ways that no one fully saw at the time, a beginning. History sometimes offers us moments that seem clear only in retrospect, where the meaning of events takes years to reveal itself fully. The Beer Hall Putsch is one of those moments. It looked to most observers in 1923 like a spectacle that had collapsed into farce. A group of armed men stopped on a cold Munich street, their leader fleeing and hiding, their cause apparently finished. And for a time, that reading seemed correct. The Germany of the mid-1920s was not a country racing toward catastrophe. It was a country trying, imperfectly and hopefully, to find its balance.
But the trial had made Hitler famous where he had only been local. The prison had given him time to write down everything he intended to do. The early release had returned him to political life before his movement had fully dissolved. And the lesson he drew from the failure, that power had to be taken gradually, through legal means, until the moment came to close the door on legality entirely, proved in the end more dangerous than any march could have been.
The men who designed the trial procedures, who allowed him to speak for hours, who sentenced him to the minimum and released him early, were not evil men in the ordinary sense. They were conservatives who shared some of his grievances, who believed he could be managed, who thought the attention would pass. They were wrong in ways that would take another decade to become fully apparent. It is, as you settle into the quiet of the night, worth carrying this thought gently, that history's most consequential turning points are rarely visible as such when they occur. The moment that changes everything often looks, at the time, like nothing very much at all. It is only in the long, slow, backward glance that we begin to see what was really happening in the rented hall, the cold street, the comfortable prison room, where a man paced and dictated and planned. Munich in November 1923 was a city of beer halls and church bells, and citizens going about their lives as citizens do, uncertain of the future, weary of the past, hoping for something steadier. The men who gathered in the Bürgerbräukeller that evening had no way of knowing that the evening would be remembered a century later, or what the chain of consequence that began that night would eventually bring. That is perhaps the most human thing about history. It happens to people who do not know they are living in it.